That was my graduation from navigation school. So that was the 11th of November 1988.
You can tell from the uniform as well, it kind of takes you back, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was just a family photo. It was my mum and dad either side of me, actually.
What was it like for you being gay and obviously in the RAF, where it was obviously something that wasn't accepted at the time?
Yeah, well, initially I didn't really even think about it. So when I first joined up, my focus was very much on getting through the training. It was very high pressure. I didn't really have time to even think about a relationship, gay or straight. When I had finished my training and was starting to settle down on what they call operational conversion units, I did actually meet a woman. Things seemed to work fine. We did get married, and we had 2 children. But it dawned on me that things weren't right. So ultimately, I came to the conclusion that no one was going to be happy in that relationship. It was a case of there was no good way out of the situation. I could either stay married, in which case I would be unhappy, which would ultimately make my wife unhappy and potentially lead to me being dishonest, seeing people behind her back and so on, which just did not sit right with me at all. Or I had the opportunity to separate, divorce, which I knew was going to be painful and difficult for people, but ultimately gave us both the opportunity for a life where we could be happy.
I imagine as well, coming to the realisation yourself that you were gay and perhaps this relationship wasn't for you, would be pretty scary at that time, and also with the profession you had.
Very much so, because I knew that although I now recognise that I was gay, I couldn't do anything about it. There was no way on earth I could allow that information to become public knowledge, because that would be the end of my career. I did start seeing my partner, who lives here in Worcester, or who lived here in Worcester at the time, and that was a 500-mile distance. So I thought, the likelihood of being caught out there is pretty remote. And so for a while, I would take every opportunity I could to take leave from Scotland, come down here, have a weekend with my partner, and then would go back. But then you had that struggle every time you got back, because people naturally would say, "Oh, how was your weekend? What were you doing?" And you had that whole anxiety of make sure you use the right pronouns, make sure you be as vague as possible as to what you actually did, so no one can question you, no one can capture you out. So there was that constant attack on my own integrity of wanting to be honest, but knowing that I couldn't be, because it would be the end of everything. That duplicity of having to live like that was very wearing and very taxing, and it takes a lot of your mental capacity to do that. So you're in a high pressure job that requires you to be using all of your capacity, and if 10, 15, 20% of that is actually distracted elsewhere, you are not going to be the best that you can be.
So you were in Scotland at the time, and in 1995, that's when I think the term you use is you were outed.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
So I was a part of the Gay Bikers Motorcycle Club, and I had, in those good old days, actually had a physical membership card, and I had that in my wallet. Unfortunately, I lost my wallet. Someone handed that in to the RAF police. In all probability, entirely innocently, they just saw it was for someone on the station and they handed it in. They went through the wallet, found this card. This was in August 1994, in fact. I came back one day from a training mission. We landed. I'm packing up my gear to get off the aircraft as normal. And very unusually, the squadron wing commander pulls up outside the aircraft, gets on board, comes up to me and says, "Just leave that there, come with me." So instantly I knew what it was about. I knew I'd lost the wallet. I was hoping it had been lost somewhere that wouldn't have an impact, but it had been handed in. And so instantly I knew what the situation was about. And that whole humiliation of being walked off the aircraft past my friends and colleagues, that crushing knowledge that this is it. That's the end of everything that I've worked for. And it was pretty devastating. And I get driven up to the RAF police station and arrested and interviewed, effectively put under house arrest in my quarters in the officers' mess, before eventually being sent on leave and suspended. And it took something like 13 months of me desperately fighting and using every opportunity I could to convince the RAF that they were doing the wrong thing, before eventually I had to give in and I was given an administrative discharge.
What was it like with relationships, both your family and also people, your colleagues, and I imagine who were your friends as well?
I have very few friends left from the RAF, that certainly very few that I'm still in contact with. That initial couple of weeks where I was under house arrest in the officers' mess was a very strange period. In a lot of respects, it was actually quite liberating because I was no longer lying and my big secret was out in the open. And so in some respects, as I say, it was quite liberating. And actually the peers who lived in the officers' mess with me, they were all fine. All my friends and peers, no adverse reactions or anything. So none of those who I had direct contact with had any issue about it, and they were all as surprised and upset that I was going to be forced out as a result of this. I hadn't told my wife at that point in time, up to that point in time, why I had left her, because I had thought potentially she would turn around and use that as a weapon to hurt me during the divorce and so on. So I was then able to tell her why we had separated. And there was also that moment of having to come out to my parents and my family and other friends. And there was that dawning realization, oh my God, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I had signed up for the long term within the RAF. I was expecting to continue in that career until at least I was 38, I think it was, with the intention of wanting to stay on longer, assuming that I got to an appropriate rank. And so there I was at 28, 29, whatever, and I no longer had that career, the career that I'd always planned to have. So it was a case of, oh my God, what am I going to do? And so I decided that I would go into finance, accountancy, started retraining, managed to find myself a job as an accounts assistant. So there I was at like 28, 29, basically starting on the bottom rung of a new career. Other people sort of 18 or 19 years of age around me doing the same job. And so I was very much the old man amongst the group. And so it's taken that a long time to claw back. And to be honest, you never have been able to. I started my career 10 years behind everybody else. So, there are people who are my age at considerably greater levels within the business, or people at my level who are much younger. So, you never really claw that back. So, I've lost out in that respect for sure.
Now, you eventually went to the European Court of Human Rights and they upheld your case. You won, yep. But you only received a nominal compensation fee.
Yeah, I am lucky in that at least I have received something so far. So I'm one of the few who have gone all the way through the UK courts to the European Court of Human Rights. So I have received a sum of money, and on the face of it, I think it was about 130,000, something along those lines. That sounds like a lot of money, and certainly at that point in my life, it was the lifeline I needed to get me out of financial trouble and so on. It's the whole point about the European Court of Human Rights is it's not actually there to make those compensation decisions. So there was a nominal figure for some compensation, but actually the primary purpose of the European Court of Human Rights is to show to the member states, as we were at the time, that they are in the wrong, you are in breach of human rights, and to encourage them strongly to change their policies, which obviously they eventually did. So, in terms of the losses that I've had in terms of potential earnings, pensions and so on, that figure that I was awarded was nothing. I mean, there were secretaries who broke a finger on a typewriter at the MOD who got a greater compensation for their injuries. So the monetary value was not the full compensation, but at least I got something. Which there are thousands of veterans from decades who've had nothing, and they're the ones who really need something.
Well, 22 years after that ban was lifted, finally there is a review into what happened to all of those hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people who were mistreated and lost their careers because of their sexuality. What do you make of this review? Is this too little too late, or is it now it's finally happening?
It's great that it is finally happening. It is better late than never, because what we need to remember is it's not just 22 years in terms of how late it is. For there are some people going back decades to the 60s, the 50s even. So for a lot of people, this goes back a long way, where they've suffered, they've lost their careers, they've lost their salaries, they've lost their pensions, they've lost medals, they've lost friends, they've lost the support networks that normally people leaving the armed forces can depend on. They've even lost their families in some instances. Many of them, certainly in those early years, ended up with criminal records. All of us ended up traumatized from the whole process. So we need to have compensation for all of that, the hurt, the pain, the loss of earnings and so on, the mental anguish that people have gone through. But also I think very, very important is an apology. And I know the Defence Minister has already made a general apology, but I think it would be a great step to actually identify all of those individuals, which they should be able to do. They should have the records of, find those people and write to them individually and make that personal apology on a one-to-one basis. I think that would be very important. And a final thing that I think would be really helpful to come out of this review process, and I hope it does, is the provision of all of those all those veteran support functions that are available to people. Because if you think about it, normally when someone leaves the armed forces, there is a process that starts 18 months or so from the point where they were leaving, where they are prepared for that exit. They're given training, they're given courses on how to understand the civilian world, because it is a very different world to the military world. For those of us who get discharged, bang, you're out. And you don't have that, and we haven't had that support network to help us through that culture shock. And that is something I think that we really need. We want access to all the veterans' activities, the benevolent funds and so on and SAFA, the people who will give support to veterans normally. The LGBT veterans need that support as well. And there's also that aspect of actually wanting to still be part of the squadron life. So many squadrons have reunion activities, and having been excluded from those, there are some who would want to be involved in that. Yes, there are probably an awful lot who would also not want to be engaged in that respect, but to have that option available to us, I think will be very, very powerful.
Your dream was to be in the RAF when you were younger, but I can hear from what you've been saying, this was a big thing, not only for your career-wise, but your life as well. Yeah. And is this stayed with you? Is this something that has essentially kind of been there in the background for the remainder of your life so far?
Yes, I still think about the Air Force and how I would like to be involved, how I would have wanted my career to go with the RAF, the things I could have done, the things I could have experienced. When an RAF plane flies over, I'm still looking up at it, trying to identify what it is and so on. And you do get that pang of anguish. That could have been me. And I do miss it, and it has impacted my life. I've dwelled on the loss, and I've had issues throughout the last 20 odd years coming to terms with that, and they all come back to that initial dismissal and the troubles that I have had with my mental health all relate back to that fateful day where I was discharged from the RAF.
Are you angry with the RAF and as a body and the way they treated people who were gay back then and for decades?
That is a tough one. Yes and no. So they were wrong, and I was angry with them, very much so. I lost the only career that I wanted, the only one that I'd ever wanted. The individuals, as I say, locally, the ones that I knew had no issue and couldn't understand why I was being thrown out. But it was the policy. When the policy changed, although the military had fought it right up to the last minute, when it changed, the military what it does well, and instantly went into a process of designing great policies for inclusion, great policies for fraternisation and so on, that meant that very quickly they had policies in place and education that was happening that introduced LGBT networks across all of the armed forces, such that within a very short space of time, actually they became model employers for inclusion and diversity. And they're not without issues, of course not. There are still issues that need addressing. But if you look at any of the rating indexes and so on, the armed forces in the UK are actually recognised as model employers and employers of choice within the LGBT community. I currently do a lot of inclusion and diversity activities for the company that I work for these days, and I have engaged with the RAF diversity leads and had them come to our site and make presentations. And I remember the first time I invited one of them to come along, the wing commander who was actually coming to make the presentation, initially when I approached her, said, "Oh, I'm not sure if we want to come along." And I said, "Well, why not?" And she said, You'll give us a hard time." And I said, "I don't want to give you a hard time. What I want to do is highlight what an organisation can do in a short space of time if they're properly focused on doing the right thing and putting policies in place and educating people within their group to recognise that LGBT personnel are just as capable, just as able, just as valid a soldier, sailor or airman as anybody else." And when I explained it like that, actually, she was, that's actually really good. So she came along, and we've worked very closely with them since.